Welcome back, everyone. We're diving into something really interesting today. We've been getting a lot of questions about how different cultures react to, well, celebrity scandals, those moments when the people we put on pedestals kind of take a tumble. So we found this really fascinating research paper. It's from the Journal of Business Ethics, and it digs into how people in the United States and South Korea react to celebrities who've, let's just say, made some questionable choices.
Yeah, it really gets you thinking. Like, do we all see these situations the same way, or does culture play a bigger role than we realize?
That's exactly what the researchers wanted to uncover, and they were smart about it. They picked scandals that were perceived as equally bad in both countries, to make sure it was apples to apples, no cultural bias sneaking in there. What they found was pretty surprising, actually. Turns out Korean consumers are way less forgiving of celebrities who mess up compared to us Americans.
Like, their tolerance level is much lower.
Right. Makes you wonder why.
Well, one of the key takeaways from the research is that it might come down to different thinking styles. Western cultures, like the U.S., lean towards what's called analytic thinking. We tend to see things as separate parts,
Makes sense.
kind of like Western medicine, focusing on specific body parts in isolation.
Okay, I see where you're going with this. But how does that differ from how people in South Korea might view things?
So in Eastern cultures like Korea, there's a stronger emphasis on holistic thinking. It's all about interconnectedness. Imagine like a tapestry where each thread affects the whole pattern. So applying that to this context, Koreans are less likely to separate a celebrity's morality from their competence.
It's all woven together for them.
Exactly. It's not about isolating different aspects. It's about how those pieces fit together as a whole.
Okay, so that sheds some light on the overall difference in reactions. But the paper also talked about this concept of moral decoupling, something I think we're all guilty of sometimes, even if we don't realize it.
Oh, for sure. Moral decoupling is basically that mental trick we do, where we separate judgments about someone's personal life from their professional abilities.
Like, you might love a band's music even if you know the lead singer is a total jerk.
Exactly. And the study found that Americans were much more likely to do this. We can kind of compartmentalize things, allowing us to keep supporting a celebrity, despite their flaws.
But that separation is much harder for Korean consumers?
Much harder. For them, a moral failing is a moral failing, period. It doesn't matter how talented the person is.
Gotcha. But it's not just about the overall reaction, right? The study also found that the type of scandal matters too. The researchers call this transgression relevance. It's about how closely the bad behavior relates to the celebrity's job. So an athlete taking steroids is obviously a way bigger deal than, say, that same athlete getting a speeding ticket.
Precisely. And you know what? The study found some pretty interesting differences there. In the U.S., we were much more likely to forgive celebrities if the transgression wasn't directly tied to their professional skills.
Yeah, that whole, well, they're a great actor, who cares about their personal life kind of thinking.
Exactly.
Mm.
But did that hold true for Korean consumers? Not so much. They found that Korean consumers were less likely to morally decouple, regardless of how relevant the transgression was to the celebrity's job.
So even if a celebrity's mistake seems totally unrelated to their work, it still affects how Korean consumers see them.
And ultimately, it can impact whether they'll continue to support them.
Wow, that's pretty powerful. So we've talked about these fundamental differences in thinking styles, but I'm curious, what are your initial thoughts on all this? Is any of this resonating with you?
I mean, it's definitely food for thought. It makes you realize how much we take our own cultural perspective for granted. We assume everyone sees things the same way, but that's clearly not the case.
It makes you wonder how these differences might play out in other areas of life, beyond just celebrity scandals. But we'll dig into that more after a quick break. All right, so let's talk brands. I mean, think about it. Would you be less likely to buy something if, the celebrity endorsing it had kind of messed up?
Yeah, that's a great question. And actually, that's what the researchers really wanted to know, too. And their findings were pretty interesting. Turns out Korean consumers were definitely less likely to buy products endorsed by someone who, well, had messed up.
So it really does matter.
It seems to. It shows how much a celebrity's actions can actually impact a brand, especially in a culture where morality and competence are seen as so intertwined.
But here's what I thought was interesting. The study also found that this effect, like the negative impact, it was much less pronounced if the brand actually dropped the celebrity.
Oh, totally. Like,
Yeah.
they took action. It suggests that even in a culture where those lines between personal and professional aren't easily blurred, consumers are still willing to kind of give brands a break if they, distance themselves from the scandal.
It's like they're saying, hey, we hear you.
Exactly.
But it must be a tough call for brands, right? Because do you stick with a popular celebrity and risk alienating some of your customers? Or do you cut ties and potentially lose out on those like big endorsements? Tough choices.
For sure, for sure. And the stakes are even higher when you're dealing with a global market,
Hmm.
because cultural sensitivities can vary so much. What might be a small PR hiccup in one country could be a total disaster in another.
Oh, absolutely. So, okay, we've been talking about thinking styles. But the researchers also explored some other reasons why Korean consumers might be less forgiving. Like one idea was maybe they just value morality more than other traits, like competence.
Right, like it's just higher on their list of priorities.
Exactly. But did the research actually support that?
Well, not really. They found that both Korean and American participants rated the importance of morality pretty similarly.
So it's not that Koreans value morality more, it's more about how it's connected to their perception of someone's competence.
Exactly. Which, again, circles back to that holistic thinking.
Okay, that makes sense. But what about the idea that Korean consumers might just hold celebrities to a higher standard because of their fame? That whole with great power comes great responsibility thing.
Yeah, the researchers look into that too. And it makes sense, especially considering Korea's more high-context culture.
High context culture, what does that mean?
So in high-context cultures, communication is less about explicitly stating everything and more about understanding the subtle cues and context surrounding an interaction. Things like social status and seniority, group harmony, they all play a huge role.
So celebrities, with their public platform, they'd be held to a different standard.
Potentially, yeah. But interestingly enough, the study didn't find strong support for that idea either. While Koreans did think public figures should be more accountable, it wasn't enough to explain the big differences in their reactions.
Huh. So it really does seem to come back to those cultural thinking styles.
It does seem that way.
And it makes you think, right? Like, do these differences in thinking styles affect other areas of life too? Beyond just celebrities?
Oh, absolutely. The study itself focused on consumer behavior, but it opens up a much wider conversation about how our culture shapes our moral compass, what we see as right and wrong.
And how we decide what's fair, even.
Exactly. It reminds us that what seems like a simple judgment, like this person did something wrong, is actually filtered through this complex lens of cultural norms and values.
It's so true. Now, another thing the paper looked at was moral rationalization. That mental gymnastics we do to kind of justify bad behavior, like, oh, they were under a lot of pressure, or they're only human.
We've all been there.
Right. So the researchers wondered if maybe Koreans, because they're less forgiving, were more likely to do this to reconcile those feelings.
Like trying to justify it that they can still support the celebrity.
Exactly. But what did they find?
The findings on moral rationalization were actually pretty inconsistent.
So maybe it's not just about culture.
Right. It seems like other things might be at play too, like the specific situation or even just personality.
Makes sense. Okay, so to recap what we've talked about, cultural thinking styles play a huge role in how we perceive and react to those celebrity scandals. Korean consumers, with their holistic worldview, tend to be less forgiving.
And less likely to separate a celebrity's actions from their overall character.
And that difference in perspective, it actually affects brands, especially those relying on those big celebrity endorsements.
Definitely. Big implications there.
And it raises some questions about how these cultural differences are evolving as the world, gets smaller. We're all constantly bombarded with information and perspectives from everywhere.
Yeah, it makes you wonder if we're starting to see a blending of values, if you will, when it comes to moral judgments.
Are those lines between, analytic and holistic thinking becoming more blurred?
Good question. And, here's something that I found really fascinating. The paper mentions that even though Korean consumers are less forgiving, celebrity endorsements are actually more common in South Korea.
Wait, really?
Yeah. And arguably, they're even more effective there than in the U.S.
That's so interesting. You'd think brands would be hesitant to work with someone who could potentially, bring them down with one wrong move.
Right. It's a paradox. But I think it speaks to that complex relationship between cultural values and consumer behavior. Remember how we talked about high-context cultures?
Yeah, where social status and group harmony are so important.
Right. So maybe in a society that really values those things, being associated with a beloved celebrity carries even more weight. It's not just about the product, it's about sharing values.
Like, I'm part of this group and this is who we admire.
Exactly. And that feeling, that sense of belonging, it can be really powerful.
Wow. So Our culture shapes not just our judgments, but how we interact with brands too.
It seems like it.
This deep dive is really making me rethink
It
things.
is fascinating, isn't it?
Totally.
Mm.
Now, there was one thing in the paper that really stuck with me. They pointed out this assumption we have that cultural differences are kind of fading away as the world becomes more, interconnected.
Yeah, like globalization is going to make us all the same.
Right. But they actually found evidence that maybe the opposite is happening.
Like,
Cool. That some of these cultural thinking styles are actually becoming even more distinct.
hmm, that's really interesting. Like a counterintuitive effect.
Totally. So maybe it's not about erasing those differences.
Right.
It's about understanding and appreciating them.
Yeah, and maybe even using those differences to, like, communicate more effectively. Especially when it comes to, marketing and stuff.
Oh, for sure. So instead of that one-size-fits-all approach,
Right, exactly.
we recognize that what works in one culture might not work in another.
Totally.
This whole conversation has really made me think about, like, my own reactions to celebrity news. I think I'm going to be more aware of my own cultural bias from now on.
I think that's the takeaway, right? It challenges our assumptions and makes us see things from different perspectives.
It really does. And I think it shows how important it is to keep researching this stuff.
Yeah.
Because there's still so much we don't know about how culture shapes our moral compass and how that affects our behavior.
Yeah, and it's constantly evolving, right? Culture isn't static.
Absolutely not. So, next time you see a celebrity in the headlines for the wrong reasons, take a minute and think about the cultural context. What seems like a simple right or wrong might actually be much more complicated.
Way more nuanced. It reminds us that there are lots of different ways of seeing the world, each shaped by its own values and history, and recognizing those differences can help us understand each other better.
And on that note, we'll leave you with one final thought. Think about how understanding these cultural differences could help us build stronger connections in a world that often feels so divided. Something to ponder. Until next time, keep diving deep.